Lord Thelandris reclined on his throne of living wood, each armrest blooming with silver flowers that never wilted. The great hall of Sylvanthal stretched 3 stories high, its vaulted ceiling woven from ancient oak branches that had grown together over millennia. Shafts of emerald light filtered through leaves that sang in harmonies no human ear could fully comprehend. The elven lord's smile was thin and sharp as a paper cut as he gazed down on the human delegation standing on the polished marble floor below. They looked so small from up here, so fragile, clutching their strange iron tubes like children with wooden swords. "You dare threaten us?" Thelandris's laugh echoed through the hall, joined by the tinkling amusement of his court. "With, what are those, metal sticks?" He leaned forward, his amber eyes gleaming with centuries of accumulated superiority. "We who shaped the very essence of magic when your ancestors still cowered in caves? We who can call lightning from clear skies and grow fortresses from acorns?" He gestured lazily, and a ball of pure white flame materialized above his palm, casting dancing shadows across the faces of the assembled elves. "Return to your mud cities, humans. Tell your pathetic king that Sylvanthal's forests remain forbidden forever." The human envoy, a woman with iron-gray hair and a scarred face, said nothing. She simply placed one of the tubes on her shoulder, sighted down its length, and smiled. "We'll find out what happens next in just a moment. But first, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back, tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's get back to the story. 6 months before that moment in the great hall, Bastien Moreau stood at the edge of the Whisperwood forest, watching smoke rise from what used to be Claremont, the border town where his sister had lived. The elves hadn't even used fire. They'd simply commanded the earth to swallow the buildings whole, leaving nothing but a perfectly smooth meadow where homes and shops had stood for 300 years. 400 souls gone in minutes because a human merchant had accidentally cut down a tree on the forest's edge. Not even in the forest, on the edge. The message was clear. Humans were tolerated at elven sufferance, and that sufferance could be withdrawn at any moment for any reason. The kingdom of Valmont had endured this for generations. Every treaty negotiation was a humiliation. Every border dispute ended with elven laughter and casual displays of power that left human diplomats speechless. The elves controlled the Whisperwood, and within the Whisperwood grew the Lumina flowers, the source of magical essence that powered healing, agriculture, and defense across every kingdom, human and otherwise. 3 nations depended on Lumina trade. And the elves knew it. They rationed the flowers like misers, driving prices higher each year, watching human kingdoms scramble and beg. Bastien was the king's engineer, a position that sounded grander than it was. Mostly he designed better plows and reinforced bridge supports. But he'd also spent 15 years studying in secret, collecting every scrap of knowledge about Lumina magic he could find. He'd dissected dead flowers smuggled at great risk. He'd interviewed hedge witches and rogue alchemists. He'd filled journals with observations that would have gotten him executed if the elves ever discovered them. Because Bastien had a theory, one that would be called treason by half the court and madness by the rest. Magic wasn't divine. It wasn't exclusive to elves. It was a force, like wind or water, and forces could be understood. The Lumina flowers didn't create magic. They concentrated and channeled it from the environment. The petals contained crystalline structures that resonated with ambient magical energy, acting as natural amplifiers. If those structures could be replicated artificially, if their resonance patterns could be synthesized through chemistry rather than botany, then humanity wouldn't need the elves' forest at all. They wouldn't need the elves' permission. They wouldn't need to bow and scrape and watch their people die for cutting down a single tree. But theory was just theory until someone built it, and building required resources, time, and most importantly, the king's blessing. Bastien turned away from the smooth meadow where his sister's house had been and walked back to his horse. He had a proposal to write, one that would either save the kingdom or get him branded a heretic. Either way, the time for cautious engineering was over. The elves had made sure of that when they buried Claremont. They'd wanted to send a message. Bastien intended to send one back, written in a language they'd never bothered to learn. Human ingenuity.
King Philippe Renaud was 57 years old and looked 70. The strain of managing a kingdom dependent on elven mercy had carved deep lines into his face, turned his hair white, and given him a tremor in his left hand that he tried to hide during court. He sat in his private study rather than the throne room, a concession to the informal nature of this meeting. Bastien stood before the desk, his proposal rolled in his hands, while the king's advisor, Geneviève Marchand, a sharp-eyed woman who'd negotiated every failed treaty with Sylvantal, watched with crossed arms. "Let me understand this correctly," Philippe said slowly. "You believe you can create artificial Lumina essence in a laboratory, using chemicals and, what did you call them, resonance matrices?" His tone wasn't mocking, but it carried the weight of deep skepticism. "Bastien, I've known you since you were a boy following your father around the workshops. You're brilliant, but this sounds like alchemy, not engineering." He glanced at Geneviève, who shook her head slightly. Bastien unrolled his proposal on the desk, revealing diagrams and chemical formulas that had taken years to develop. "Your Majesty, magic isn't mystical. It's energy following rules we haven't fully mapped yet. The Lumina flowers work because their cellular structure creates a specific crystalline pattern that amplifies and directs magical energy. I've identified 17 key compounds in the petals. I believe I can synthesize analogs, not identical, but functionally equivalent, using minerals we already mine and plants we already grow." He pointed to a complex diagram showing molecular bonds. "It'll take time and resources, but it's possible." Geneviève stepped closer to the desk, studying the papers with narrowed eyes. "And if you fail, if you spend the kingdom's gold on this experiment and produce nothing but expensive colored water?" she asked in a hard voice, but not hostile. She was the king's pragmatist, the one who had to think about budgets and consequences. "The elves have already cut our Lumina rations by 30% this year. Our hospitals are struggling. Our mages can barely maintain the defensive wards. We're one bad harvest away from famine, and you want to gamble our remaining funds on theoretical chemistry?" "I want to gamble it on freedom," Bastien said quietly. The room fell silent. Every negotiation with Silventhal is a humiliation. Every treaty gives them more power over us. They buried Claremont, 400 people, as a warning, not as punishment for a real crime, but as a reminder that that they own us. He met the king's eyes. Your Majesty, we can't win a war against elven magic, but we don't need to. We just need to break their monopoly. If we can synthesize even a fraction of what Lumina provides, we have leverage. If we can synthesize all of it, he paused, letting the implication hang. They become just another kingdom, one with pretty trees and arrogance, but no economic stranglehold. King Philippe was quiet for a long moment, his trembling hand finally stilling as he made his decision. "How long?" he asked. "How long until you know if this works?" Bastien had prepared for this question. 6 months for a viable prototype, 1 year for production scale. But Your Majesty, I need complete authority and secrecy. If the elves discover what we're attempting, they'll crush us before we can finish. This must be hidden as a mining operation or agricultural research. The king nodded slowly, then reached for his seal. "You have your year, Bastien, and may whatever gods still listen to humans help us if you're wrong."
The old iron mine outside Marcheval had been abandoned for 20 years, its veins tapped dry and its tunnels considered unstable. It was perfect. Bastien stood in the largest cavern, 300 feet underground, watching workers install equipment by lamplight. The official story was that new surveying techniques suggested untapped deposits deeper in the mountain. The real story was taking shape in this converted space. Glass vessels and copper pipes, distillation columns and crystallization chambers, all arranged in careful rows like the organs of some vast mechanical beast. Alain Dubois, the kingdom's finest chemist, was already setting up her workspace in an alcove carved specifically for precision measurements. She was younger than Bastien, barely 30, but she'd published treatises on mineral composition that impressed scholars across 3 kingdoms. She'd also been dismissed from the Royal Academy for suggesting that magic could be studied scientifically rather than mystically. When Bastien had approached her with his proposal, she agreed before he'd finished explaining. "Finally," she'd said, "someone with sense and funding." The team was small by necessity, 12 people total, each sworn to secrecy and each bringing specialized knowledge. Etienne Garnier, a miner who understood stone and earth better than any mage understood their spells, had reinforced the cavern and designed ventilation that would carry away chemical fumes without advertising their presence to the surface. Aurélie Fontaine, a botanist who'd spent years studying Lumina flowers before the elves banned such research, had brought her notes and a few precious seeds from specimens she'd managed to keep alive. And Julien Mercier, a metalworker whose family had been killed in Clermont, worked with quiet fury, fashioning the precise instruments their experiments required. The first 3 months were failures. Beautiful, expensive failures that filled journals with valuable data but produced nothing that could amplify magic. Bastien watched compound after compound failed to crystallize correctly, watched solutions that should have resonated with magical energy remain inert, watched his team's enthusiasm slowly erode into grim determination. The king sent monthly inquiries. Geneviève visited twice, her expression growing more skeptical each time. The elves raised Lumina prices again, and 2 hospitals in the capital had to close wings.
But on the 97th day, Elaine called Bastien to her station with barely controlled excitement vibrating in her voice. In a crystallization dish sat a cluster of pale blue crystals, so similar to natural Lumina formations that Bastien's breath caught. "Test it," he whispered. Elaine placed the crystals in a copper frame connected to a simple magical circuit, the kind used to light rooms in wealthy homes. She spoke the activation word, channeling the tiny amount of personal magical energy every human possessed. The circuit glowed, not brightly, not like natural Lumina would power it, but it glowed. The crystals worked. They were crude, inefficient, probably 1/10 the effectiveness of natural Lumina, but they worked. In that moment, deep underground in a hidden workshop, the balance of power in the world shifted. The elves just didn't know it yet.
The next 4 months blurred together in a haze of sleepless nights and incremental improvements. Bastien moved his sleeping quarters into the workshop, a small alcove near the main laboratory where he could wake at any hour to check on crystallization processes or review Elaine's latest compound modifications. The rest of the team followed his example, transforming the mine into a strange underground village where time was measured in successful experiments rather than sunrise and sunset. Each iteration brought them closer to matching natural Lumina's efficiency. Elaine discovered that trace amounts of silver dissolved in the growth solution improved crystal formation by 40%. Aurelie found that mimicking the pH balance of Whisperwood soil increased the crystal's magical conductivity. Etienne developed a method of slow cooling the compounds that prevented fractures in the crystalline matrix. The improvements compounded, each small victory building on the last, until their synthetic Lumina, they'd started calling it Solara, a name Aurelie suggested, reached 60% efficiency compared to natural flowers. But 60% wasn't enough. The kingdom couldn't simply replace Lumina with a weaker alternative and expect the elves to shrug and accept their lost monopoly. They needed parity or better, and they needed it in quantities that would flood the market before Sylvanthal could respond. The problem was scale. Their best crystals required specific environmental conditions during formation: temperature, humidity, ambient magical energy levels that were difficult to maintain in large batches. One crystallization vessel took 9 days to produce enough Solara for a single hospital room's lighting. They needed thousands times that output. Julien proposed a radical solution. Instead of growing crystals individually, create an entire chamber where conditions could be controlled precisely across dozens of vessels simultaneously. The concept was sound, but it required engineering that pushed beyond anything they'd attempted before. They'd need to excavate a massive new cavern, install climate control mechanisms that didn't exist yet, and design monitoring systems that could track conditions in real time. It would take months and the majority of their remaining budget. Bastien didn't hesitate. He approved the expansion immediately. The excavation revealed something unexpected. 20 feet deeper into the mountain, Etienne's crew broke through into a natural cavity that had formed around a vein of crystallized minerals unlike anything in the geological surveys. The formations glowed faintly in lamplight with an inner luminescence that made Elaine's eyes widen. She took samples immediately, running them through every test she knew. The analysis came back impossible. The minerals naturally concentrated ambient magical energy, exactly what Lumina flowers did, but they were geological rather than biological. The mountain itself had created what they'd been struggling to synthesize. When Elaine added trace amounts of the mineral to their Solara formula, efficiency jumped to 94%. They'd found their missing piece not through chemistry, but by digging deeper than anyone expected they'd need to go. Sometimes, Bastien reflected, the best discoveries were the ones you literally stumbled into in the dark.
News from the surface grew worse as their progress underground accelerated. The elves had discovered, or perhaps simply decided, that human herbalists were misusing Lumina flowers by grinding them into medicines rather than using them whole for magical applications. It was a distinction that had never mattered before, a technicality buried in centuries-old treaties that no one had enforced. Now, suddenly, it was grounds for sanctions. Silventhal cut human Lumina access by another 40% overnight. Hospitals across Valmont had to choose which patients received magical healing and which would be treated with conventional medicine, slower, less effective, sometimes fatal when magic would have saved them. The Royal Guard's defensive wards flickered and failed, forcing commanders to rely on conventional soldiers at border posts, where magical creatures sometimes wandered from the deep forests. 2 farming communities saw their magically enhanced crops wither, facing a harvest that would leave families hungry through winter. The elves' message was clear: submit completely or suffer. King Philippe called an emergency council. Bastien attended, standing in the back of the room while nobles argued strategy. Duke Armand wanted to send another delegation to Silventhal, offering greater concessions in exchange for restored Lumina access. Duchess Margot argued for rationing what little Lumina remained, prioritizing essential services. Baron Laurent suggested the unthinkable, forming an alliance with the mountain orcs who had no love for elves, even if it meant accepting orcish warriors on Valmont's borders. Every suggestion carried the stink of desperation and defeat. Genevieve finally slammed her hand on the council table, silencing the arguments. She turned to Bastien. "Engineer Moreau, you've been very quiet. I assume there's a reason the king summoned you to this council?" Every eye in the room shifted to him. Bastien felt the weight of their attention, their skepticism, their fading hope. He'd prepared for this moment, rehearsed what he'd say, but now the words felt inadequate. "We have an alternative," he said simply. "We've synthesized a compound that replicates luminous properties at 94% efficiency. We are prepared to begin mass production within 3 weeks. Within 3 months, we can supply the entire kingdom's needs without purchasing a single flower from Silventhal." The room erupted. "Impossible," the nobles said. "Heresy," said the archbishop. "Too convenient," said Duke Armand, his suspicion clear. "If this were possible, why hasn't anyone done it before? The elves have held this monopoly for 1,000 years. Bastien met his gaze steadily. "Because no one else was desperate enough to try. Because studying Lumina is forbidden by treaty, and most kingdoms obeyed. Because everyone accepted that magic belonged to magical races, and humans should be grateful for scraps." He paused. "We stopped accepting that the day they buried Claremont. Your Grace, I have samples. Test them yourselves. The compound works." King Philippe, who had been silent throughout the council, finally spoke. "Show them," he said quietly. Bastien reached into his coat and pulled out a small crystal that glowed with soft blue light. The room fell absolutely silent as he handed it to the archbishop, who handled it with trembling fingers like it might explode. Sometimes, Bastien thought, the most powerful weapon wasn't a sword or spell. It was proof that the impossible
had already happened.
The mine transformed into a factory over 3 frantic weeks. The massive climate-controlled chamber Julian had designed went into operation, housing 200 crystallization vessels arranged in precise rows. Each vessel grew Solara continuously, a 9-day cycle that meant every day brought fresh batches ready for harvesting. Elaine trained 24 assistants in the delicate process of extracting and purifying the crystals without damaging their structure. Aurelie oversaw quality control, ensuring every batch met their efficiency standards. The operation ran day and night, fueled by urgency and the knowledge that each day of elven sanctions cost lives. The first production batches went to hospitals. Physicians who'd been rationing magical healing suddenly had Solara crystals that worked nearly as well as natural Lumina at a fraction of the cost. The difference was immediate and measurable. Survival rates climbed, recovery times shortened, pain that had been endured was relieved. Word spread quickly through the medical community, despite orders for secrecy. Something had changed. Someone had found an answer. The doctors didn't care about the source. They cared about saving patients who had died waiting for elven-controlled medicine. The Royal Guard received the next shipments. Captain Rousseau, a veteran who'd fought magical incursions for 30 years, personally tested Solara-powered defensive wards at the northern border post. He reported they held strong against the same forest wraith attacks that had penetrated weakened Lumina wards the week prior. More importantly, the Solara wards didn't flicker or fade. Their power remained constant, stable, predictable. "It's better than what the Elves sold us," Rousseau wrote in his report. "Whatever this is, we need more." But secrecy couldn't hold forever. The Elves had spies in every human court, informants in every major city. Bastien knew they were operating on borrowed time before Sylvanthal discovered that Valmont's sudden reduction in Lumina purchases wasn't due to capitulation or rationing, but replacement. He'd hoped for 3 months of production before the revelation. They got 6 weeks. The messenger arrived at dawn, his horse lathered with sweat from a hard ride. Sylvanthal's ambassador demanded an immediate audience with King Philippe. They knew. The audience was scheduled for noon in the Great Hall, the same hall where this story had begun, though that moment was still days away. Lord Thelandras would attend himself, an honor that hadn't been granted to Valmont in 50 years. Except it wasn't an honor. It was a threat. The Elves sent their high lords only when they intended to demonstrate power so overwhelming that rebellion became unthinkable. Thelandras would come to discover the source of Valmont's Lumina alternative, destroy it, and ensure such innovation never threatened elven supremacy again. Bastien stood in his workshop, watching his team harvest fresh Solara crystals, and made a decision. The Elves expected to find a secret laboratory they could shut down, researchers they could intimidate, equipment they could smash. They wouldn't find that. They'd find something that couldn't be intimidated or destroyed because it had already spread too far to contain. He'd make sure of it.
Bastien didn't wait for Thelandras' arrival. He dispatched riders to every city, town and village in Valmont that very hour, each carrying documentation, complete formulas, synthesis procedures, equipment specifications, everything needed to produce Solara crystals. He sent copies to universities, trade guilds, merchant consortiums, and private alchemists. Within hours, the knowledge was distributed across the kingdom. Within days, it would spread beyond Valmont's borders to neighboring nations who also suffered under elven monopoly. The decision violated every instruction about secrecy. Geneviève arrived at the workshop, her face flushed with fury. "What have you done?" she demanded. The Landress arrives tomorrow, and you've just handed our only leverage to anyone with a chemistry set. If the elves can't destroy the source, they'll destroy us for creating it." Her anger was justified. This was reckless. This could mean war. But Bastien had thought it through during sleepless nights, running scenarios and outcomes until his mind ached. "They can't destroy all of us," he said quietly. "Lady Marchand, the elves maintain power through scarcity and fear. They control access to magic, so they control kingdoms. But what happens when magic isn't scarce? When every town can produce its own Lumina alternative? When every nation has the formulas? When knowledge spreads too wide to contain?" He gestured to his team, who'd stopped work to listen. "We're not just breaking a monopoly. We're ending an era. The elves can kill me. They can burn this workshop. But they can't kill an idea that's already taken root in 1,000 minds." Genevieve's expression shifted from anger to understanding, then to something like awe. "You've turned us all into complices. Every kingdom, every alchemist, every scholar who receives those formulas becomes part of this revolution, whether they plan to be or not." She laughed suddenly, a sound sharp with stress and dark humor. "You've backed the elves into a corner, where they can either accept the change or declare war on half the world. Bastien, this is either brilliant or it's suicide." "Maybe both," Bastien admitted. He looked at his team, Elaine with her stained fingers from years of chemical work, Etienne with his scarred hands from mining, Aurélie who'd risked execution to keep her botanical research alive, Julian, who'd lost everything to elven cruelty. "I'm tired of begging. I'm tired of watching people die because an ancient race decided we don't deserve the tools to save ourselves. If this is how we make them listen, then so be it." He turned back to Geneviève. "When Thalandrus arrives tomorrow, he won't find a secret laboratory to destroy. He'll find a kingdom that's already moved beyond needing his permission to exist. Tell the king, I'll stand before the High Lord personally. I'll answer for everything we've done, but I won't apologize."
The great hall of Valmont's palace had been prepared for the elven delegation with careful attention to protocol that everyone knew was meaningless now. Banners hung from the rafters, musicians played soft melodies, wine from the royal cellars waited in crystal decanters, but the atmosphere was funereal rather than celebratory. Nobles lined the walls in their formal attire, watching the massive doors with expressions ranging from fear to resignation. King Philippe sat on his throne, outwardly calm, though Bastien could see the tension in his shoulders. Lord Philandrus entered like he owned the palace, which in a very real sense he did, or had, until 6 weeks ago. His entourage of 12 elven mages moved with the fluid grace of water, their silver robes shimmering with woven enchantments. The Landress himself was ancient beyond human comprehension, his features ageless and perfect, his eyes holding the casual cruelty of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. He didn't bow to the king. He simply stopped 10 paces from the throne and smiled. "Your Majesty," the Landress said, his voice carrying the musical quality all elves possessed, "I understand congratulations are in order. Valmont has discovered an alternative to Lumina flowers. How industrious!" The word dripped with contempt. "I came personally to examine this miracle of human ingenuity. Surely you'll grant me that small courtesy? A tour of the facility where these wonders are produced?" It was a trap dressed as a request. Refuse, and Valmont admitted they had something to hide. Accept, and Philandrus would study their methods, find weaknesses, steal their processes, or simply destroy everything with a gesture.
Bastien stepped forward before the king could respond. Lord Thelandris, I am Bastien Moreau, Royal Engineer and Director of the Solara Production Initiative. I'd be honored to answer your questions. I held the elf's gaze, refusing to look away despite the weight of centuries pressing down on him. However, there's no single facility to tour. The production formulas have been distributed across the kingdom. Currently, 43 separate workshops are producing Solara crystals, with more coming online daily. We've also shared the synthesis procedures with 6 neighboring nations. The temperature in the hall seemed to drop 10 degrees. Thelandris's smile didn't waver, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. How generous, he said softly. Tell me, Engineer Moreau, do you understand what you've done? For 1,000 years, the balance between our peoples was maintained through careful agreements. Humans received magic's benefits in exchange for respect and deference. You've shattered that balance. You've stolen what was never yours to take. Magic isn't property, Bastien replied. It's not something that can be owned by one race. We didn't steal it. We understood it. We learned to work with the same forces you've manipulated for centuries, just through different methods. If that threatens the balance, then perhaps the balance was always unjust. The nobles in the hall gasped. No one spoke to elves this way. No one survived speaking to elves this way. But Bastien continued, his voice steady. You buried Claremont. 400 people dead because of a tree. You strangled our hospitals and let our people die to prove a point about power. So yes, Lord Thelandris, I understand what we've done. We've proven we don't need your permission to survive.
Lord Thelandris's expression shifted from amusement to something colder, more calculating. He raised one elegant hand, and the air in the great hall thickened with power. Frost crept across the marble floor in intricate patterns. The musicians' instruments went silent, strings snapping under sudden cold. Every human in the room felt magic pressing against them like deep water, ancient, vast, and utterly indifferent to mortal concerns. This was the power that had kept kingdoms subservient for centuries. This was why no one challenged the elves. You speak of justice, Engineer, Thelandris said, his voice now empty of warmth or music. Let me speak of consequences. Every tree in Whisperwood is connected through root and magic. Every elf in Sylvanthal can draw upon that collective power. We are not merely a nation, we are a living spell woven over millennia. Your little crystals, your clever chemistry changes nothing. We could reduce Valmont to ash and bones in an afternoon. Your cities would burn with emerald fire. Your fields would become forests that eat any human who enters. Your children would die, Bastien interrupted quietly. Yes, Lord Thelandris, our children would die, just like the children in Claremont died, just like patients in our hospitals died when you cut our Lumina access. We already know what elven power means for us. You've demonstrated it repeatedly. He took a step forward, despite the magical pressure trying to hold him in place. Elaine had insisted he carry a Solara crystal before entering the hall, claiming it would offer some protection. He'd thought it superstition, but now he felt the faint warmth radiating from his pocket, a small defiance against ancient power. Thelandris felt it too. Bastien saw recognition flicker across the elf's ageless face. You're wearing one now,
Thalandris said with something like surprise. A human, protected by synthetic magic. How quaint. He lowered his hand and the pressure in the room eased slightly. Very well. You wish to discuss consequences? Then understand this. Silventhal hereby declares complete economic embargo against any nation producing or using your Solara crystals. No trade, no treaties, no diplomatic contact. The Whisperwood closes its borders absolutely. Every elven merchant in human cities will return home within the month, taking their knowledge of healing magic, their understanding of deep enchantments, their 1,000 years of accumulated wisdom. It was a catastrophic threat. Elven knowledge had shaped human civilization for centuries. Their insights into medicine, agriculture, architecture, magical theory. To lose that exchange would set human advancement back generations. Nobles shifted nervously. King Philippe's face went pale. But Bastien felt something unexpected. Relief. Because Thalandris had just admitted the truth beneath all elven superiority. The embargo was defensive. If elven wisdom and power were truly insurmountable, if their magic genuinely made them gods among mortals, they wouldn't need trade embargoes. They'd simply wave a hand and make the problem disappear. The fact that Thalandris was threatening rather than acting meant one crucial thing. He was afraid. Afraid that humans might not need elves anymore. Afraid that the balance of power was shifting in ways even elven magic couldn't stop.
The palace was in chaos after Thalandris departed. Nobles argued loudly about the embargo's implications. Duke Armand demanded Bastien's immediate arrest for provoking the elves. Duchess Margot called for a diplomatic mission to Silventhal to negotiate terms. The archbishop suggested prayer and penance. Through it all, King Philip sat silent on his throne, looking older and more exhausted than Bastien had ever seen him. Finally, the king raised a hand and the arguing stopped. "Bastien," he said quietly, "speak plainly. Can we survive this? Not just economically. Can we survive losing everything elven knowledge provides?" The question carried the weight of the kingdom. Every eye in the council chamber fixed on Bastien, waiting for an answer that would decide whether they doubled down on this new path or tried to salvage whatever relationship with Silventhal remained. Bastien had prepared for this moment too. "Your Majesty, the elves' greatest weapon isn't their magic. It's our belief that we can't survive without it. Yes, we've relied on their knowledge for centuries. But why? Because they shared some insights, and we stopped seeking our own. Because it was easier to purchase solutions than develop them." He pulled a folder from his satchel, laying it on the council table. "I've compiled a list of every major advancement attributed to elven wisdom over the past century. Improved crop yields, achieved through magical enhancement of soil, but we've developed non-magical fertilization techniques that show equal promise. Advanced healing, Lumina-powered, but conventional medicine has made tremendous progress wherever necessity forced innovation." Elaine stepped forward. She'd insisted on attending the council this time, refusing to hide underground while others decided their fate. "My lords and ladies, I've studied both elven and human approaches to the same problems. The elven solutions are more elegant, yes, faster, certainly, but not unique. They developed their methods over centuries because they had time and power. We've developed ours in months because we had desperation and brilliance." Genevieve had been reviewing the documents Bastien provided. Now she looked up, her expression thoughtful rather than skeptical. "You're proposing we treat this embargo not as a catastrophe, but as liberation.
cut the dependency entirely, accept short-term pain for long-term independence. She turned to the king. Your Majesty, it's risky, but consider the alternative. We submit to Sylvanthal, destroy our Solara production, and return to complete dependence on a power that's already demonstrated willingness to let our people die to maintain control. That's not security. That's a slow death. The king listened to each speaker, then closed his eyes briefly as if consulting something internal. Conscience, courage, or perhaps just exhaustion. When he opened them, something had shifted. The tremor in his hand had steadied. He stood from his throne, and for a moment, Bastien saw the young warrior prince Philip had been 40 years ago, before crown and burden aged him prematurely. Sylvanthal wants us to beg, the king said clearly. They expect us to panic, fracture, and return with apologies and tribute. Instead, we're going to do something they never anticipated. We're going to succeed without them. Bastien, Elaine, you have full authority to expand Solara production and research. Genevieve, establish trade agreements with every nation brave enough to accept our alternative to elven magic. Armand, prepare the military for potential escalation, though I suspect the elves will watch rather than attack directly. They're arrogant, not suicidal, and they know starting open warfare might unite every human kingdom against them. He swept his gaze across the assembled nobles. This council is adjourned. We have work to do. History will remember this moment when humanity stopped kneeling and stood up. Make sure it remembers us well.
The next 3 months tested Valmont in ways war never had. The elven embargo wasn't just economic. It was comprehensive and calculated to cause maximum disruption. Every elven merchant, teacher, and advisor left human lands overnight, taking with them active enchantments that collapsed when their creators departed. Defensive wards on border fortresses failed. Healing sanctums in hospitals went dark. Agricultural enhancement spells that had sustained the capital's food supply for 50 years simply stopped working, leaving fields that produced half their expected yield. But Bastien had anticipated much of this, and what he hadn't predicted, his team adapted to with remarkable speed. Elaine developed a crash training program for conventional chemists, teaching them Solara synthesis in intensive 2-week courses. Within a month, 43 production facilities became 200. Within 2 months, those 200 were producing enough Solara to meet the kingdom's basic needs with surplus for export. The crystals weren't as elegant as natural Lumina, but they were reliable, affordable, and, most importantly, available without begging elven permission. The Royal Guard replaced failed elven wards with human-engineered alternatives that combined Solara crystals with practical fortifications. Captain Rousseau reported the new defensive systems actually performed better against conventional threats, though they lacked the aesthetic beauty of elven work. The elves built poetry, Rousseau said in one report. We're building walls that work. I'll take functional over pretty any day. His soldiers agreed, especially after the new wards held strong during a coordinated goblin raid that would have breached the old enchantments. Medical innovation exploded out of sheer necessity. Physicians who'd relied on Lumina-powered healing for decades were forced to rediscover surgical techniques, herbal remedies, and physical therapy approaches that had been abandoned as primitive. A young doctor named Isabelle Beaumont published a treatise on non-magical trauma treatment that combined ancient remedies with new understanding of anatomy and infection control. Her methods couldn't regrow lost limbs like the most powerful elven healing magic, but they saved lives at a fraction of the cost and dependency.
Hospitals across 6 nations adopted her protocols. The agricultural crisis proved harder. Elven-enhanced fields had produced triple yields for generations, and losing that overnight meant food shortages that winter. But orally, the botanist who'd studied forbidden luminous specimens developed crop rotation techniques combined with natural fertilizers that showed promise for long-term soil enhancement. It wouldn't match elven magic for years, but it was sustainable and didn't require purchasing anything from Sylvanthal. "We'll be hungry this year," she told farmers gathered at a demonstration plot, "but free. Next year will be better. The year after, better still. And our children won't have to bow to anyone for the right to eat." Trade delegations arrived from neighboring kingdoms, some curious, some desperate, all aware that Valmont had accomplished something unprecedented. The Kingdom of Alençon purchased Solara production licenses immediately, their queen personally thanking King Philippe for showing us what independence looks like. The Merchant Republic of Bretagne sent their finest chemists to study under Elaine. Even the mountain dwarves, who'd maintained neutral relations with elves for centuries, expressed interest in alternatives to Lumina-dependent enchantments. Slowly, a new economic network emerged, one built on shared knowledge rather than monopoly, on human ingenuity rather than elven condescension.
But the elves weren't simply watching passively. Sylvanthal's response was more subtle than military action, but equally dangerous. Elven merchants in neutral kingdoms began spreading rumors that Solara crystals were unstable, prone to catastrophic failure that would kill users. Elven diplomats suggested that human-made magic was unnatural and would corrupt the ambient magical energy of regions where it was used extensively. Some kingdoms hesitated, caught between desire for independence and fear of elven retaliation or genuine magical catastrophe. Bastien knew they needed a demonstration, something so undeniable that rumors and fear-mongering would crumble against reality. He proposed something audacious during a council meeting, a grand exposition in Valmont's capital, open to every nation, where Solara applications would be demonstrated publicly and tested by independent observers. Let them see the crystals work. Let them test them personally. Let representatives from 20 kingdoms witness that our alternative isn't just functional, it's superior in many applications because we designed it for human needs rather than elven aesthetics. King Philippe approved the exposition immediately, and planning consumed the next month. A massive pavilion was constructed in the capital's central square, not with elven enchantments, but with human engineering and Solara-powered mechanisms. The structure featured climate control systems that maintained perfect temperature, lighting arrays that rivaled natural sunlight, and demonstration stations where visitors could personally test Solara crystals in various applications. Invitations went to every major kingdom, neutral nations, and even, in a move that Genevieve called beautifully provocative, to Sylvanthal itself. The exposition opened on a cold morning in late autumn. Thousands attended the first day. Kings and merchants, mages and farmers, scholars and soldiers. They watched Solara-powered healing save a man who'd been injured in a construction accident. They tested defensive wards against magical attacks and physical assaults. They examined agricultural applications that improved crop yields without making soil dependent on continued magical enhancement. Every demonstration was documented, verified by independent observers, and shown to work exactly as promised. By the third day, 12 nations had signed trade agreements for Solara crystals. By the seventh day, even the cautious kingdoms that had hesitated were placing orders. And on the 10th day,
an unexpected visitor arrived at the pavilion gates requesting entry, an elven delegation from Sylvanthal, led by Lady Eowyn Silverleaf, second only to Lord Thelandris in their hierarchy. The elves had come to see what humanity had built without them.
Lady Eowyn moved through the exposition pavilion with the careful attention of a scholar examining something that shouldn't exist. Unlike Theandris's theatrical contempt, her expression showed genuine intellectual curiosity mixed with something that might have been concern. Her 3 accompanying mages tested each Solara application with sophisticated magical analysis, their hands moving in complex patterns as they measured energy flows and crystalline resonance. Bastien followed at a respectful distance, answering technical questions when asked, but otherwise letting the demonstrations speak for themselves. At the medical demonstration station, Eowyn watched a Solara-powered healing array close a deep laceration on a volunteer's arm. The healing was slower than elven magic would have accomplished, taking minutes rather than seconds, but it was thorough, clean, and left no scarring. "Functional," Eowyn murmured, more to herself than anyone present. "Crude by our standards, but functional." She turned to Bastien. "You've achieved approximately 70% efficiency of natural lumina in this application. Impressive for synthetic work, though hardly superior." "We're not trying to match elven magic in every application," Bastien replied calmly. "We're trying to solve human problems with human solutions. That healing array doesn't require a trained mage to operate. Any physician with basic instruction can use it. Your healing magic is more powerful, Lady Eowyn. But how many elven healers serve in human hospitals? How many were willing to teach their techniques before the embargo?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, because both knew the truth. Elven knowledge had always been shared sparingly, maintained as leverage rather than offered as aid. They moved to the agricultural station, where Aurelie explained her crop enhancement system. Unlike elven magic that forced plants to exceed their natural capacity, resulting in spectacular yields but exhausted soil, her approach combines Solara-enhanced growth with careful nutrient management and soil health monitoring. The yields are lower initially, perhaps 60% of what elven enhancement produces, but the soil improves each year rather than degrading. In 5 years, this method will outproduce magical enhancement because the foundation remains healthy. She met Eowyn's eyes directly. "We're building sustainability, not dependency." One of Eowyn's mages, a younger elf whose name Bastien hadn't caught, spoke up with barely concealed frustration. "You understand you're describing primitive agricultural techniques dressed up with basic magical augmentation? This is what our ancestors abandoned 3,000 years ago when we learned to truly work with living magic." His tone carried the dismissive superiority Bastien had heard from countless elves, the assumption that newer meant better, that elven methods were inherently optimal. But Eowyn raised a hand, silencing her companion. "Velian, consider what you're seeing. These humans have replicated in months what our civilization took centuries to develop. Their approach is different from ours, yes, more mechanical, less elegant. But efficiency isn't measured only in raw power or aesthetic beauty. It's measured in accessibility, sustainability, and adaptability to user needs." She turned back to Bastien,
and for the first time he saw something other than elven superiority in her expression. He saw respect, grudging but genuine. "You've forced us to confront an uncomfortable question, Engineer Moreau. What if our way isn't the only way? What if all these centuries we've been so convinced of our superiority that we stopped innovating ourselves?" The admission shocked everyone present, Bastien, Aurélie, even Eloin's own mages. An elf acknowledging that elven methods might not be optimal was unprecedented, possibly heretical by Sylvanthal's standards. Eloin seemed to recognize the magnitude of what she'd said because she straightened, her expression closing off again into diplomatic neutrality. "I will report my observations to Lord Theandris and the Council of Ancients. This exposition has been enlightening." She paused at the exit, looking back at the dozens of demonstration stations, the crowds of humans and other races examining Solara applications with enthusiasm rather than fear. "You've changed something fundamental, whether you intended it or not. The world you're building won't have room for the old hierarchies. I'm not certain how Sylvanthal will respond to that reality, but you should prepare for their answer carefully."
Sylvanthal's answer came 3 weeks after the exposition closed. It wasn't military force or further economic sanctions. It was something far more insidious. Elven agents began purchasing Solara crystals through intermediaries, taking them back to the Whisperwood for analysis and replication. Within days, Sylvanthal announced they would produce their own, refined version of the synthetic crystals, claiming elven expertise would perfect what humans had crudely initiated. The price would be competitive with human-produced Solara, backed by the prestige of elven craftsmanship and the implicit promise that elven versions would be superior. The strategy was brilliant and vicious. If Sylvanthal couldn't maintain their Lumina monopoly, they'd simply co-opt the alternative and use their reputation to recapture the market. Nations that had nervously embraced human-produced Solara might easily be swayed back to elven suppliers, especially if elven versions offered even marginal improvements. The economic network Valmont had built over months could collapse in weeks, and the elves would emerge having lost nothing but pride, which they'd quickly recover by claiming they'd always known synthetic magic was possible, but had simply chosen not to pursue lesser methods until humans forced the issue. Bastien called an emergency meeting of his core team, plus Genevieve and the king's military advisor. He laid out intelligence reports on the table. "They're going to flood the market with elven-branded Solara," he said. "We need to respond before they establish dominance." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications. After everything they'd built, after proving human ingenuity could match elven monopoly, they faced losing it all to the same power structures they'd worked to dismantle. Elaine spoke first, her voice tight with frustration. "We can't compete on prestige. Even if our crystals work better, which they do because we've had more practical testing, nations will choose elven versions because of the name alone. 1,000 years of reputation doesn't evaporate in a few months." She wasn't wrong. The elven brand carried weight that human engineering couldn't match simply through quality or price. But Julienne, who'd been silent through most strategic discussions, leaned forward with an intensity that commanded attention.
Then we don't compete on prestige. We compete on something the elves can't match. We make it impossible for them to profit." He pulled out a sheet of calculations. "Their production costs will be higher than ours. They're using traditional elven crafting methods applied to synthetic processes, which is inefficient. We're using purpose-built industrial techniques. If we drop our prices below their production costs and sustain it, they'll be selling at a loss. How long can even Sylvantal bleed money before their merchants demand they stop?" It was economic warfare, blunt and potentially catastrophic if Valmont miscalculated. But Genevieve was already running numbers, her eyes sharp with calculation. "We'll need to maintain reduced prices for at least 6 months, possibly a year. That means operating our own production at minimal profit or temporary loss. Can we sustain that?" She looked at Bastien, who'd overseen all financial projections for the Solara initiative. Bastien had considered this exact scenario during sleepless nights planning for every possible elven response. "We can if we expand distribution and increase volume. Lower prices means more sales, wider adoption, faster integration into daily use across multiple nations. The elves are treating this as a prestige market, limited production of refined crystals for wealthy clients and essential services. We'll treat it as a utility market, mass production for everyone from hospitals to farmers to household lighting. We'll make Solara so ubiquitous and affordable that elven versions become luxury items for people with more gold than sense." King Philippe, who'd been listening quietly, finally spoke. "You're describing democratizing magic, making it as common as bread or iron tools. The elves won't just see that as economic competition, they'll see it as existential threat to their entire worldview." His tone wasn't objection, but acknowledgement of stakes. "If we do this, if we succeed, we're not just breaking a monopoly, we're fundamentally changing what magic means in this world. It stops being the privilege of an elite race and becomes a tool anyone can access and improve. The elves will never forgive us for that." "Good," Bastien said simply. "Let them remember us as the ones who ended their 1,000-year reign. Lady Elowin saw it at the exposition. The old hierarchies can't survive what we're building. Better to push forward and shape that new world than hesitate and let the elves recapture control." He looked at each person in the room, seeing determination reflected back. "We price Solara at cost, plus minimal markup. We open production licenses to any kingdom, guild, or community that wants them. We publish the synthesis formulas in academic journals across the world, and we watch Sylvantal try to compete with a movement that's bigger than any one kingdom or race."
The market war lasted 8 months, and it was brutal for both sides. Valmont operated Solara production at barely sustainable margins, relying on volume, and King Philippe's willingness to subsidize the initiative as national defense spending. Sylvanthal poured resources into their competing product, backing it with centuries of accumulated wealth and the fierce determination not to lose face. For a time, the outcome seemed uncertain. Would economic reality force Valmont to raise prices, or would elven pride crack first under sustained losses? The turning point came from an unexpected direction. Small producers, individual alchemists, village cooperatives, merchant guilds in minor kingdoms began manufacturing solara using the publicly available formulas. Their production quality varied, but their prices undercut even Valmont's reduced rates because they operated with minimal overhead and no concern for national economic policy. What had started as a war between Valmont and Sylvanthal became something neither had fully anticipated, a genuinely distributed industry that no single power could control or suppress. Sylvanthal's merchants were the first to break ranks. 3 major trading houses that had invested heavily in elven solara production petitioned the Council of Ancients to end the initiative, pointing out they'd lost more wealth in 8 months than in the previous century of Lumina trade. "We're competing against distributed production by hundreds of small operators," their petition argued. "Every gold piece we lose trying to dominate this market is gold we can't invest in actual elven interests. This is pride speaking, not wisdom." The council's response was to double down, insisting that elven prestige required maintaining position in the synthetic crystal market regardless of cost. But the merchants simply stopped complying. They quietly withdrew from solara production, redirecting resources to traditional elven goods where their reputation actually provided competitive advantage. Within weeks, Sylvanthal's solara output dropped to a fraction of its peak. Not because humans won, but because the elves' own economic system refused to sustain an unprofitable venture based solely on pride. Bastien received the news while touring a new solara production facility in Alençon. A messenger from Valmont brought reports of elven withdrawal from the synthetic crystal market, along with a letter from Genevieve. "You were right. They couldn't compete with a movement. The market is ours, or rather, it belongs to everyone, which amounts to the same thing. The Landress is reportedly furious, but fury doesn't change economic reality. You've won, Bastien. Now comes the harder part, building something lasting from this victory." The celebration was muted because everyone understood Genevieve's warning. Breaking a monopoly was dramatic and satisfying. Building stable, equitable systems to replace it was thankless work that would take decades. But as Bastien watched Alençon's chemists, trained by Elaine's methods, using equipment designed by Julien, following formulas developed through desperate innovation, produce crystals that would heal their kingdom's sick and light their streets, he felt something close to peace. This was what victory looked like. Not a throne room confrontation or a battlefield triumph, but hundreds of ordinary people doing extraordinary work because someone had proven it was possible. He returned to Valmont 3 days later to find the capital transformed. Solara-powered streetlights illuminated roads that had been dark for generations. Hospital wards that had operated at quarter capacity during the embargo were full again. Physicians moving confidently with reliable tools. The Royal Guard's new defensive installations stood solid around the city, human-built and maintained without requiring elven permission or participation. And in the market square, merchants sold solara crystals alongside vegetables and fabric, pricing them like the commodity they'd become, rather than the luxury they'd once been. King Philippe summoned Bastien to a private audience that evening. The king looked different, younger somehow, despite the months of stress. The tremor in his hand had vanished. "I'm establishing a new position," Philippe said without preamble. "Minister of Innovation. It will oversee not just engineering, but all initiatives focused on reducing dependency and increasing self-sufficiency. The position is yours if you want it, though I warn you it will be even more thankless than your current work." Bastien considered the offer seriously. Minister of Innovation meant politics,
endless council meetings, navigating noble egos and international diplomacy. It meant less time in workshops and more time in throne rooms, but it also meant ensuring that the revolution they started didn't stop with Solara crystals. It meant fostering a culture of human ingenuity that would outlast any single person or project. "I accept," he said finally, "on one condition. Elaine gets full authority over the Royal Academy's chemistry program, and we establish publicly funded research institutions in every major city. If this transformation is going to last, it needs infrastructure for the next generation of innovators." "Done," the king agreed immediately. "Anything else?" Bastien thought of Claremont, the smooth meadow where his sister's house had been, the casual cruelty that had sparked everything that followed. "A memorial," he said quietly, "at Claremont, not to mourn what we lost, but to remember why we changed, so that future generations understand that accepting the unacceptable has consequences, and that sometimes the only response to impossible odds is to do the impossible anyway."
5 years after that first crystal glowed in the hidden workshop, Bastien stood again at the edge of Whisperwood Forest. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him stretched a trade caravan of 40 wagons carrying human-manufactured goods, textiles, tools, Solara crystals, and agricultural equipment, bound for Sylvanthal's border market. The Elves had reopened limited trade 6 months ago, not from generosity, but from necessity. Their economy, built on magical monopolies that no longer existed, had contracted painfully. They needed human goods now, needed the innovations that had emerged from desperation and ingenuity. The forest itself looked different. The trees at the edge showed signs of stress: browning leaves, thinning canopy, exposed roots where soil had eroded. Bastien's botanical contacts suggested the Whisperwood's health was tied to its magical resonance, and that resonance had weakened as Lumina's economic power faded. The forest had sustained the Elves' superiority, and without that purpose, it was slowly dying. There was poetry in that, though Bastien took no pleasure from it. He'd never wanted to hurt the Elves. He'd wanted freedom from their control. The forest's decline was an unintended consequence of change. Lady Elwyn met him at the border crossing, her silver robes less elaborate than they'd been at their first meeting. "Minister Moreau," she greeted him formally, using his new title with slight irony. "Welcome to Sylvanthal's Reach. The Council of Ancients has agreed to discuss potential collaboration on forest restoration techniques. We've noticed your agricultural researchers have developed methods for healing damaged ecosystems that our magic cannot seem to address." It was a remarkable admission. The Elves needed human help to save their sacred forest. Bastien felt the full weight of how completely the world had shifted in 5 years. "I'm certain we can assist," he said diplomatically. "Our botanists would be honored to study Whisperwood's condition and propose treatments. In exchange, perhaps your lore keepers might share knowledge about magical theory that they've previously kept restricted, not as charity, as mutual benefit between equals." Elwyn's expression flickered with something that might have been amusement or pain. "Equals," she repeated softly. "A year ago, Thelandris would have struck you down for that presumption. Today, it's simply accurate." She gestured to the path leading deeper into the forest. "The council is divided. Some, like Thelandris, still believe elven superiority is natural law and this disruption is temporary aberration. Others recognize that the world has changed irrevocably, and we must adapt or become irrelevant. I'm uncertain which faction will prevail." They walked in silence for a time, human and elf, side by side, beneath ancient trees. Finally, Bastien spoke. "Lady Elwyn, I never hated your people. I hated being controlled by them. There's a difference." He paused, choosing words carefully. "The elves accomplished wonders over millennia. Your culture, your magic, your understanding of the natural world, these are genuine achievements worthy of respect. But they shouldn't come with the price tag of other races' subjugation. What we're building now, this new order where knowledge flows freely and innovation comes from necessity rather than permission, there's room for elven wisdom in it, just not elven dominance." Elwyn considered this as they approached a massive oak that served as the council's meeting hall, its trunk hollowed out and shaped into chambers over centuries. "You're offering partnership," she said. "Help us save our forest in exchange for knowledge we've hoarded, mutual respect between cultures that were master and subject 5 years ago. Some of my people will see that as victory, proof we remain essential. Others will see it as the final humiliation, needing those we considered lesser. But I see it as perhaps the only path forward that doesn't end in irrelevance or war. The old hierarchies are dead. Minister Moreau, let's see if we can build something better from their remains."
The negotiations took weeks and involved more compromise than either side found comfortable. But eventually, agreements were reached. Elven law keepers would establish exchange programs with human universities, sharing magical theory in return for human innovations in chemistry and engineering. Elven healers would train human physicians in techniques previously kept secret, while human doctors taught conventional medicine that didn't require magical talent. The Whisperwood would become a joint research preserve, studied and protected by both races working together, rather than elves guarding it jealously from outside contamination. It wasn't perfect. Tensions remained. Thalandris never accepted the new order and withdrew to the deep forest with a faction of elves who refused contact with humans. Some human kingdoms exploited their newfound advantages with the same cruelty elves had once shown, requiring mediation and occasionally sanctions. The transition was messy, uneven, sometimes painful, but it was happening. This fundamental restructuring of how races related to each other and to magic itself. Bastien returned to Valmont after the agreements were finalized, traveling through kingdoms where solar streetlights had become so common that children didn't remember when darkness ruled nights. He passed academies where students of multiple races studied together, learning that knowledge belonged to whoever was curious enough to seek it. He saw hospitals where both magical and conventional medicine were practiced side by side, physicians choosing tools based on effectiveness rather than prestige. He watched farmers using techniques Aureli had developed, growing crops that would feed communities for generations without exhausting the land. At Claremont, the memorial he'd commissioned stood complete. It wasn't grand, just a simple stone circle marking where the town had been, with plaques explaining what had happened and why it mattered. Families visited regularly, some to mourn relatives lost to elven cruelty, others to remind themselves how far humanity had come. Bastien stood in the center of the circle, remembering his sister, remembering the fury and desperation that had driven him to attempt the impossible. "We did it," he whispered to ghosts and memory. "We broke free, and we did it not by becoming stronger than them, but by refusing to accept that their strength made them our masters."
He placed a Solara crystal at the memorial center, its blue light glowing steady in the dusk. The sun set over the meadow where Claremont had stood, and across the kingdom thousands of Solara lights began glowing, human-made magic illuminating a world that had moved beyond the old hierarchies into something new and uncertain and free. It wasn't the ending of a story, but the beginning of an era, written not in elven script on silver leaves, but in human determination, and the simple, revolutionary act of refusing to stay lesser because someone more powerful said you should. This was humanity's moment, not a conquest, but an awakening, not destroying the elves, but no longer needing them. And in workshops and laboratories across 6 nations, the next generation of innovators was already at work, pushing boundaries that didn't exist a decade ago, proving that the greatest magic wasn't what you were born with, but what you built with your own hands and mind. The elves had banned humans from their forest. Humans had synthesized its magic and bankrupted their kingdom's monopoly. But more importantly, humans had proven something that would echo through generations. Power based on monopoly and control is fragile, but power built on shared knowledge and determined innovation is nearly unstoppable.